This is the second part of the respiratory system. So the respiratory system can be divided into two functional zones, the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. The conducting zone includes our nose, nasal cavity, paranasal sinuses, pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, and some bronchioles. Whereas the respiratory zone includes bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveoli. So the conducting zone, as its name implies, conducts or transmits air from the atmosphere into our alveoli. But this zone not only transmits air from the atmosphere into our alveoli, it simultaneously, as it transmits, warms the air, especially during the cold season. It also cleans the air we breathe in, meaning removes dirt from the air we breathe in. It also humidifies the air we breathe in or adds moisture to it in the form of water vapor. These three functions are done by the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, which lines our trachea and bronchi. What happens in the respiratory zone is exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between alveolar air and capillary blood, which is in the capillary surrounding our alveoli. Functions of the respiratory system are gas exchange, sound production, heat and water inhalation, smell, and pH regulation. Let's see each one of them one by one. Gas exchange means the intake of oxygen and release of carbon dioxide. That's what is meant by gas exchange. Sound production is, as you all know, the sound we emit as we speak is produced by vocal cords which are located in our larynx. Since larynx is part of our respiratory system, so sound production is considered as function of the respiratory system. Heat and water exhalation is because if you breathe on the back of your hand, if you do experiment by breathing out on the back of your hand, you will feel the air you breathe out is warm. That means we exhale, we release heat with the air we breathe out. That's why here it is mentioned heat exhalation. If you breathe on a window glass, you will see that the window glass becomes foggy. That is because the air we breathe out contains water vapor. It is the water vapor which makes the window glass foggy. Smell is done by our nose using structures within our nasal cavity. So that's why we say smell is a function of our respiratory system, because our nose is part of our respiratory system. pH regulation. pH means pH is a unit of measurement of acidity and alkalinity. So the way our respiratory system regulates pH is, or in other words, the way our respiratory system prevents from extreme acidity from happening is, the way our respiratory system prevents extreme acidity happening in our body is actually explained by this formula. The more carbon dioxide there is, it reacts with water and produces carbonic acid, which is this. And carbonic acid dissociates into hydrogen ion and bicarbonate. So the more carbon dioxide in our body, the more of this reaction happens, more of carbonic acid is produced, and more hydrogen ion is released. The more hydrogen ion there is in our body, the more acidic our blood becomes. So the way our respiratory system prevents severe acidity from happening is by blowing out, by breathing out carbon dioxide. By the way, if you see a patient breathing deep and fast, that means they are acidotic. It is our respiratory system's response to acidity, trying to blow out to get rid of the excess carbon dioxide, which would have participated in this chemical reaction, finally releasing hydrogen ion. So our respiratory system prevents extreme acidity from taking place by getting rid of the excess carbon dioxide from our system. Gas, or specifically oxygen and carbon dioxide, which is in our bloodstream, is transported in these ways. For example, oxygen is transported. 1.5% of the oxygen which is being transported in our bloodstream is transported dissolved in blood plasma. The remaining 98.5% is transported attached to hemoglobin, which is part of erythrocytes or red blood cells. Carbon dioxide is transported 7 to 10% dissolved in plasma, 20% attached to hemoglobin, but the majority, 70%, is transported as bicarbonate. You remember we just saw that this chemical reaction takes place in our body, right? This chemical reaction takes place when carbon dioxide reacts with water, right? So this bicarbonate is main means of transportation of carbon dioxide. So when it arrives in our alveoli, when it is brought to our alveoli, this chemical reaction takes place in this opposite direction. These two arrows are showing that the chemical reaction takes place both ways, forward and backward. So after this bicarbonate arrives at the respiratory zone of the respiratory system, this chemical reaction takes place in the backward direction. Carbon dioxide is produced, which is transferred into the alveoli and breathed out. So this is to show you the way oxygen and carbon dioxide are transported by our blood. Let's discuss mechanism of breathing. This picture is intended to show you what happens during inhalation and exhalation. Mechanism of breathing is about the phenomenon, about the process which happen during inhalation and exhalation, or during breathing in and breathing out. So there are basic rules we need to know in order to understand the mechanism of breathing. A certain amount of air contained in a volume will have higher pressure as the volume in which it is contained decreases. So the less the volume in which a certain amount of gas is contained, the higher the pressure. And the more the volume, the less the pressure. This is one rule. The other rule is air flows from high pressure to low pressure. We are going to compare atmospheric pressure with the pressure within the lungs. Pressure within the lungs changes as muscles involved in respiration contract and relax. Let's start by looking into inspiration. Inspiratory muscles are, especially during quiet, normal inspiration, diaphragm and external intercostal muscles. Diaphragm normally, when relaxed, it is dome shaped. So when it contracts, it flattens and moves down into the abdomen, pressing the content of the abdomen downwards. So as the diaphragm moves down and the thoracic cage moves up because of the contraction of the external intercostal muscles, the volume of the thoracic cavity, in other words, the volume of the lungs, increases. As the volume of the thoracic cavity increases, lungs stretch and pressure within lungs decreases and becomes lower than atmospheric pressure. And we said gas moves from higher pressure, which in this case is higher in the atmospheric air, and lower in the lungs, so gush of air starts to flow from the atmospheric air into our lungs. This is how inspiration takes place. Just to repeat, external intercostal muscles, which are these ones, contract, and diaphragm contracts and flattens. That way, when the diaphragm flattens, it moves down, it goes down, presses against abdominal organs. When the volume of the thoracic cavity increases, the air within the lung will occupy more space. So we said as volume increases, pressure decreases, and the pressure within the lungs becomes lower than atmospheric pressure, so air flows from the atmosphere into the lungs. This is what happens during normal, quiet, rested condition. If we run, if we engage ourselves with exercise, and we have to breathe forcefully, then other additional muscles like the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is in our neck, and the scalene muscles, which are also in our neck, will be also contracting, and they will be pulling on the thoracic cage, lifting our thoracic cage higher and further increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity, because at the same time the diaphragm is going to lower down. That will make the pressure within the thoracic cavity, within the lungs, lower further, and that will invite more air to flow from higher atmospheric pressure into our lungs. So this is what happens during inspiration. Let's look at another picture which demonstrates what happens during expiration. During normal expiration or during normal breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes, and when it relaxes, it resumes its former relaxed dome shape. During inspiration, as I said, it was flattened and going down, but when it assumes dome shape, it goes up, squeezing on the lung upwards. And the elastic tissue within the lungs recoils and contracts back. That makes volume within the thoracic cavity less, and as volume decreases, pressure within the thoracic cavity increases and becomes higher than atmospheric pressure. So air moves from higher pressure within the lungs into the lower pressure in the atmosphere in the opposite direction. This is what happens during quiet, normal, rested expiration or exhalation or breathing out. I'm repeating, diaphragm relaxes and assumes dome shape. As it assumes dome shape, it pushes against our lungs upwards, making the volume of the lungs less. And elastic tissue within our lungs, they recoil. As they recoil, they squeeze the lung. So volume within the lungs becomes less. As volume decreases, pressure within the lungs increases, and air flows out of our lungs from higher pressure within our lungs into lower pressure of the atmosphere. How about during forced expiration? That means when if we have been exercising, or while we are exercising, while we are running. In that case, the muscles which are added in addition to the recoil of the elastic tissue within the lungs, and in addition to the relaxation of the diaphragm and assuming dome shape and pushing upwards, in addition to that, abdominal muscles and internal intercostal muscles are involved. Abdominal muscles, that is the external oblique, internal oblique, transverse abdominis, and internal intercostal muscles contract, further shrinking the size of the thoracic cavity. This results in the volume of the lungs decreased. As volume decreases, pressure in the lung increases, becomes higher than the atmospheric pressure, that causes the flow out of air out of our lungs into the atmospheric air. This is what this picture demonstrates. So muscles involved in expiration are forced expiration during exercise and any activity are internal intercostal muscles and abdominal muscles. The recoil of the lungs and the relaxation of the diaphragm is still there in addition.